Welcome back to the vault, and this an episode of story time. The doors to the vault are about to open and take us on another adventure from our archives. As always, be a friend to the channel and please like this video and subscribe. Today's story takes us all the way back to 1961 and back to the very beginning, the very first documented, recorded, and investigated case of alien abduction. This is the story of the Betty and Barney Hill abduction. The Hills lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Barney was employed by the United States Postal Service, while Betty was a social worker. Active in the local Unitarian congregation, and the Hills were also members of the Civil Rights Party, the NAACP, and community leaders, and Barney sat on the local board of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. They were an interracial couple at the time, when it was particularly uncommon in the United States. Barney was black and Betty was white. On the 19th of September 1961, Barney and Betty Hill were returning from a holiday. Middle-aged, the Hills were respectable pillars of the community, living quiet, decent lives. They drove overnight from Montreal, Canada, to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Their journey took them through forested and deserted White Mountains of New Hampshire. Both observed a bright light in the sky under the moon. As they drove, both believed it to be following the car. The couple rationalized that it was an aircraft or satellite of some type. Many hours later, on their arrival back in Portsmouth, the couple were puzzled. The journey seemed to have taken a couple of hours longer than it should have. The Hills were worried by this missing time. More alarming still, they also had a selection of minor cuts, grazing, and clothing damage that they could not remember receiving. Frightened, the Hills began to suspect that something very odd had happened to them. In the following months, Betty suffered from severe nightmares of a kidnapping. Betty was interested in UFO stories, and she began to believe that during their journey, she and Barney had been abducted and taken on board a spaceship. Barney began to recall that while still on their drive, he had pulled over in the car and observed the light through binoculars, revealing it to be an odd-looking flying vehicle, a flying saucer with extensive windows, bright lights, and variable geometry wings. It was clearly not of this earth. Through the craft's large windows, Barney Hill could see humanoid beings standing as they controlled the craft by manipulating long levers. To Barney's horror, some of these creatures were grinning as they looked right back at him. Anxious to escape this ominous presence, the Hills then drove on at high speed. Eventually, the Hills sought help, initially from UFO investigators, who seemed to leak a couple of the details to the press. The Hills had wanted their experience to remain private. Increasingly distressed, the Hills looked for more professional help. Hypnotized by the distinguished psychiatrist Dr. Benjamin Simon, both gave detailed accounts of what they believed had happened on their fateful drive. This is the most important points of their story as recorded by Dr. Simon in 1964. The Hills had been forced to stop their car by a landed spaceship and its crew, who compelled their captives to board their vessel. Their kidnappers were small greyish-coloured men who seemed to be conducting a scientific investigation of Earthlings. After performing a strange, bumbling but painful and degrading medical examination of the hills, what seemed like the alien's leader showed Betty a star map. The alien, who spoke English, told her that the map showed trade and exploration routes between stars, and that our sun and the alien's home star were marked on it. He pointed out roughly where he and his crew came from. The abducting aliens intended that the hills would be unable to remember their ordeal, presumably using their advanced technology to block the couple's memories. The hills were dazed and confused, but they were released and allowed to go on their way, while the spaceship disappeared into the dark, starry sky. It should be emphasized both that Dr. Simon believed that the hills were utterly sincere, but sharing a delusion, and that Dr. Simon personally believed that he had witnessed UFOs, so he was no way a stereotypical, mean, old skeptic. Since the account of Betty and Barney Hill and their story has been repeated so often by others that it has become almost cliché. The circumstances are the same: nighttime abduction by little grey men, bizarre and unpleasant medical tests, release, amnesia of the events followed by nightmares, and the eventual total recall under hypnosis. But we must remember that Betty and Barney Hill were the very original and first, just certainly not the last. Under hypnosis with Dr. Simon, Betty was able to redraw the map the alien leader had shown her. Betty was vague about what the map actually showed. Sometimes she referred to as showing stars and planets. Her sketch was reproduced in books and magazines. In the late 1960s, a teacher called Marjorie Fish, who was an elementary school teacher and amateur astronomer, intrigued by the star map, Fish wondered if it might be deciphered to determine which star system the UFO came from, assuming that one of the 15 stars on the map must represent Earth's sun. Fish constructed a three-dimensional model of nearby sun-like stars. Studying thousands of vantage points over several years, the only one that seemed to match the Hill map was from the viewpoint of the double star system of Zeta Reticuli, about 39 light years from Earth. Fish sent her analysis to Webb. Agreeing with her conclusions, Webb sent the map to Terence Dickinson, editor of the magazine Astronomy. Dickinson did not endorse Fish and Webb's conclusions, but for the first time in the journal's history, Astronomy invited comments and debate on the UFO report, starting with an opening article in the December 1974 issue. In the hypnosis sessions with Dr. Simon, both Barney and Betty Hill shared a lot of details that were very similar, and their accounts were aligned. Over the years, Betty has been subject to multiple lie detector tests, which have all resulted in positive results. Remember, this was a quiet and reserved couple that desired no media attention, and since 1961 have not gained any financial gain from relaying their accounts. Let's hear what Betty Hill had to say about their experience and their abduction in her own words.
September 19, 1961. Barney and I driving home from Montreal, saw a strange light in the sky, which changed direction, came in, started following us. In an area known as Indian Head, it came out over the highway, stopped in midair, and Barney got out with the binoculars in an attempt to identify this craft. You know, the old-fashioned straw hats that men used to wear, the flat crown and the brim, that's what it was shaped like. And then along one side, it had a big picture window, and it had dividers in it. And as he's looking up at it, and he could see people standing in the windows looking down at him, and the craft began to descend, and he had the feeling they were trying to kidnap him. He ran back to the car. We went speeding down the highway to avoid capture, and then later they were standing in the middle of the road blocking our way. This is what we saw when the car motor stalled out.
I see.
And they're separating and coming up towards us.
This is your view then of the UFO people from out your car window?
Right.
Okay, so I count.
This is our first view.
There's about a
Okay.
half dozen there.
Actually, there were 11.
Talk to me about the features in here and what you remember. I mean, look at this one's face in particular. Tell me what we see
I mean,
there.
you can see they're very human appearing.
Yeah.
Only here, you know, the eyes are wider spaced than ours.
Okay.
See?
Right.
The nose is smaller and a thin slit for a mouth. No hair, no protruding part of the ear. We were taken on board, and we were told to relax, no harm was going to come to us, and we did. And they did some testing of both Barney and me, and showed me the star map of where they were from. There it is.
Yep. Oh, okay. This is the map you drew.
Yep.
Now, this is amazing because how much did you know about astronomy?
Not a thing. About 6 weeks later, Barney and I had gone out in the evening, and when we came home, on the kitchen table was a pile of dried leaves, which wasn't there when we left. And when I went to clean up the pile of dried leaves, there was my blue earrings I was wearing that night. See, the experience itself happened in 1961. But it was not known until a Boston newspaper reporter found out about it. And it ran for 5 days on the front pages of the Boston newspaper. I went on TV. I was questioned by F. Lee Bailey. And then I sat down and had lie detector testing in front of the whole country. And I had very, very high ratings for honesty and truthfulness.
Whether you believe or not in Betty and Barney Hill's account of that evening in 1961, Barney died in 1969 and Betty followed in 2004. For the entirety of the rest of their lives, they never changed their stories. What happened that fateful evening in 1961? The details that they shared became the cornerstone of alien abduction cases in the world of ufology. As always, let us know in the comments what you thought of Betty and Barney Hill's abduction story. Thanks for joining us here for this episode of Storytime, and join us again very soon here on The Vault, a safe place for paranormal evidence.